Today, we're really going to dig into the systematic construction of slavery. This isn't just one story, you know? It's about how an entire institution was built, piece by brutal piece. From that horrific journey across the Atlantic to the actual laws that cemented it in place, and crucially, the powerful resistance that fought against it. So, let's explore how this system really worked.
Let's start with just one number, 20%. Think about that for a second. That was the average death rate for Africans who were forced onto ships during what we called the Middle Passage. 1 out of every 5 people who boarded that ship never saw land again. Just gone.
And at its core, this is what it all boils down to. This quote right here, it just lays it all out. The entire system was built on this one fundamental idea, the complete dehumanization of people, turning them into property. That concept is absolutely central to understanding everything else that we're going to talk about.
So our first section gets into the brutal economics of the slave trade. And this is key. It wasn't just random, chaotic cruelty. Oh no, it was a system. It was a calculated business model where human lives were literally weighed against profit.
The scale here is just staggering. To feed the massive demand for labor on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations in the Americas, more than 10 million Africans were captured and shipped across the ocean. This was a global enterprise, a massive, horrific machine.
Okay, this slide. This really shows the cold, hard logic behind it all. Ship captains basically had 2 options, loose packing or tight packing. Tight packing meant cramming the absolute maximum number of people below deck. Now they knew more people would die from disease this way, but the sheer volume meant that even with more deaths, more total survivors would make it to the destination, and that meant higher profits. Human life was just a variable in a profit equation. It's truly chilling.
The process of turning a person into property, it started the second they were captured. First, their heads were shaved. The reason given was to prevent lice, but it was also the very first step in a systematic process of stripping away their identity, their culture, everything that made them who they were.
And then they were branded with hot irons, just like you'd brand livestock. This mark wasn't just a mark, it was a permanent sign of ownership, searing the status of property right into their skin.
On the ships, it was even worse. They were treated as nothing more than cargo. I mean, there are records of captains cutting off the ears of those who died, just as a gruesome kind of receipt to prove to their investors that the person had been on board. They had to make sure they wouldn't lose money on the dead. So even in death, their bodies were just part of a financial transaction.
So you have this incredible physical brutality, but that had to be backed up by a legal framework. Once in the American colonies, this system of bondage had to be written down, deliberately forged into law to make it permanent and inescapable.
You can see how this happened over time. It wasn't an overnight thing. It really starts in 1619 with the first captured Africans arriving in Virginia. Then, by 1640, you have the John Punch case, where the courts make a clear link between race and punishment. He was an African servant who got lifelong servitude for the same crime that only got his white counterparts a few extra years on their contracts. But then, 1662, that was the game changer.
This law, with this Latin name, Partus Sequitur Ventrum, was the legal linchpin of the whole system. It basically means that which is born follows the womb. And what it did was establish that a child's legal status, free or enslaved, came from their mother, not their father. This single law meant that slavery became a self-perpetuating institution, legally trapping generations to come and making it incredibly profitable for slave owners.
Of course, to have a practice so totally at odds with ideals of freedom and equality, you have to justify it somehow, right? So a whole ideology was built to do just that. Africans were called savages. The Bible was twisted to argue that this was all part of God's plan, and a whole racial pseudoscience was cooked up to claim that Africans were biologically inferior. These weren't just random prejudices. They were ideas created specifically to rationalize the unjustifiable.
But, and this is so important, the people subjected to this system never ever just accepted it. Which brings us to this powerful story of resistance, a story that completely challenged that definition of people as property. I'm talking about the story of the Amistad. And really, this is the question the Amistad case forces everyone to ask. If people are legally defined as cargo, what in the world does it mean when that cargo rises up, seizes the ship, and demands its freedom?
So get this. In July of 1839, 53 Africans who had been illegally captured and sold took over the Spanish ship La Amistad. They tried to force the crew to sail back to Africa, but they were tricked and ended up off the coast of New York. They were arrested, and this kicked off a huge legal battle. Suddenly, you have the Spanish government, the ship's crew, everyone was in court claiming these human beings as their property. The case went all the way up the ladder. The first court, the district court, sided with the Africans. It ruled they were free people who had been kidnapped. But the U.S. government, acting for Spain, appealed. The circuit court agreed with the first ruling. Still, the government wouldn't give up. They appealed one last time, taking the case all the way to the Supreme Court.
And in 1841, the final verdict came down, and it was a landmark. You had former President John Quincy Adams arguing passionately for their freedom. The Supreme Court ruled 7-1 in favor of the Africans. The court's decision was crystal clear. These people were not and had never been property. They were free individuals illegally captured who had every right to resist and go home.
So, what's the takeaway from all this? What's the lasting impact? Because the story doesn't just end there. It really leaves us with this enduring question about legacy and justice.
The Amistad verdict was a huge deal. Now, it didn't end slavery, not by a long shot, but it poured fuel on the fire of the abolitionist movement. For a lot of Americans, this case forced them to confront the brutal reality of the slave trade and the humanity of the people it oppressed. It put the issue front and center in a way it hadn't been before. And that really brings us to our final thought. We've seen a system built on a calculus of cruelty, forged into law, and met with incredible resistance. So the question we're left with is this: how do the echoes of these laws, this system, and that powerful spirit of resistance continue to shape our world today? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.